So thank you all for joining us. Before I get started, let's all acknowledge that the land that we're on is located on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. I'm in the city of Boulder, which resides on land that was cared for and called home by the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute people, and other Native peoples from time immemorial. This land holds great historical, spiritual, and personal significance for its original stewards, Native nations and peoples of this region. Let's recognize and continually support and advocate for the sovereignty of the Native nations in this territory and beyond. Thank you. I'm glad you're here. I'm an oceanographer at the University of Colorado Boulder. I know you're thinking, how can someone who lives in the mountains be an oceanographer? But it is possible. We use computers and sometimes we go on ships. But my research focuses on the exchange of carbon dioxide between the atmosphere and the ocean as part of the global carbon cycle. And I came to Boulder last August, about a year ago, to continue my studies of how the climate system works, and also to grow a network of climate change scientists and communicators as we grapple with figuring out what to do about climate change. And what I've learned is that the most important thing we can do to help solve climate change is to talk about it. And a key point to understand about climate change is that it doesn't happen all at once, and it doesn't happen in equal parts across the whole planet. And there are places in the world that are already in distress because of climate change, while other places don't realize they're being impacted by it yet. Kind of like here in the United States. So given this, it's important to think about climate justice, that our actions affect other people who don't live where we live. And given world events following George Floyd's senseless murder, Cal and I are concentrated on the concept that there will be no climate justice until there is racial justice. And we're interested in continuing this conversation after our presentation today. So if you'd like to talk more, feel free. Or if you'd like to chat with us another time, we certainly make ourselves available to chat by way of phone, Zoom, text, social media, you name it. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge this extensive but incomplete list of Black United States Americans who have been senselessly murdered. And with yesterday's news that no justice will be served to the police who murdered Breonna Taylor, this is a grave time. This verdict is yet another time that Black people are told that their lives do not matter. And it's unacceptable. And it's also why each of us must work daily to show them that they do. So Cal and I, we both strive to be active anti-racists every day. Keep in mind, though, that the words that I say today will not be perfect. I'm not a Black woman, and I will never tell the story in the way that a Black woman in the United States in 2020 would. In addition, I strive to reach your hearts today by way of speaking and with Cal's illustrations, but I also acknowledge my part in perpetuating racism in my lifetime. So the format of today's presentation is going to go something like this. Following the 2020 thread, our favorite thing to talk about, by the way, 2020. I'm going to share a few stories and talk about what we can do. And while I'm speaking, you're going to get to watch Cal, as he mentioned. And I do have slides, but my slides are mostly bare because Cal is the star of this show. Although the illustrations that I do have, some of what I do have, come from Cal as well. Oh, and I did not change my background. There we go. So here's one that he drew of himself drawing on my slide, if you can see it. But don't worry if you're not watching mine, because like I said, I've kept them very, very simple. They just are scattered a little here and there with some illustrations that Cal has made from a previous talk that we gave. And then most importantly, we're going to open up the Zoom room for discussion following our presentation. So make a note if something comes to mind while you're an engaged listener this evening. I think you'll find that listening to me speak while watching Cal sketch really brings listening to a whole new level. It really does for me. And my experience was kind of like watching Cal to see if he got it right. No pressure, Cal. But he really does a great job. He's amazing. So thank you again for being here. Cal shared this quote from Dan Rome in a previous talk of ours on why visuals and art are important, particularly when communicating complex issues like racism and climate change. So I'm going to read it. Dan says, the single greatest challenge to leaders today, including thinkers, teachers, managers, presidents, parents, designers, CEOs, and students, all of us, is this. We have to make more increasingly complex ideas more clear, more quickly, and more persuasively than ever, to more audiences who are more informed and have more access to more information than ever. Want to make a difference? Be vivid. So for a complex issue like climate change, Cal says he can proactively use visuals strategically when he communicates, but he's not a scientist. So together, we work at the intersection of the arts and the sciences so that we can do just this, present complex ideas in a vivid way. So pandemic disease is of a disease prevalent over a whole country or the world. When we hear the word pandemic, we often think of COVID-19, and sometimes we even think of racism. I've heard and maybe even said racism is the other pandemic. However, the two are deeply intertwined. I recently wrote an op-ed in the local Boulder newspaper saying that the two are the same. Racism is typically not measurable, where COVID-19 is very measurable. So let's take a look at the crucial points of 2020 and then follow how they are connected. And this presentation, I'm hoping, will give us a needle's view of the interwoven fabric that is Earth's rapidly changing climate and how COVID-19 and racism are part of that fabric. So starting with that fabric, when you think of fabric, do you think of thousands or millions of threads stitched together to create it? What I'm sitting in front of, if you can see my slide, is colorful. I'm sitting in front of what we call warming stripes. And these show the temperature of Earth since the year 1850. And blue colors represent cool temperatures, and red colors represent warm and hot temperatures. So from left to right, from 1850 until present, Earth's temperature was cool, then it started to warm, and now it is hot, which is here behind, here behind my head. So Earth has a fever, and we're all feeling the effects. And you know when you have a fever, you just feel like something is off, and that feeling is kind of like that feeling something is off in 2020. That's the feeling of Earth having a fever. Earth knows it and we know it. So I'm going to circle back around to the idea of climate change fabric, but if you will, keep this in mind as you go. "2020, the year of the COVID-19 pandemic, or at least the year it arrived in the United States. Millions of people are grieving. Perhaps even a month ago, you didn't know personally of anyone who tested positive for COVID, but now you know or have heard of multiple people. Our lives have changed, and they changed very quickly, and they will continue to change. And that's because the fabric is changing. 2020 is also the year that we called racism a pandemic. I wonder if we will also remember this as the year that we woke up to climate change as a consequence of systemic racism. COVID-19, I said this about climate change, is not affecting all communities equally. And in fact, nationwide, as per covidtracking.com, Black people are dying at 2,371 times the rate of white people. That's an astounding number. And every time I see it, I just have to sit with it. And my slides are now out of order. Actually, I didn't get one. Okay, so I'm gonna tell you what it said. Our local COVID-19 racial data from Boulder County shows that Hispanic and Latinx people make up 13.8% of the population of Boulder County, yet 36.9% of COVID-19 cases are by Hispanic and Latinx people, and the percentage of hospitalizations is 47.8%. So in taking almost 14% of the population, but 37% of the cases, and of those cases, almost 48% are hospitalized. That really hits home for me. This is where I live, and these are my neighbors and my coworkers and my community, and a lot of others too that are on this call. Stacy Patton, who is a writer, author, and scholar, tells us that COVID-19 tells the story of American history. American history predicts how people of color are impacted by COVID-19. With high levels of unemployment, mass incarceration, chronic pre-existing medical issues, poor housing and homelessness, combined with low levels of reliable access to quality health care and having to work a job that will not pay you unless you physically show up, we could have predicted how Black people in the United States would be impacted by something such as COVID-19. So hopefully I've convinced you that the real pandemic is racism. And we can certainly continue to talk about this following this presentation. But first, I'd like to talk about racism according to author and scholar Ibram Kendi. Ibram wrote a book in 2019 called How to Be an Anti-Racist. And I think Ibram's delivery of what racism is in 2020 is quite accurate. So I want to see if this resonates with you, and I'm going to read it. I'm going to read what I wrote, but this is my summation of Ibram's concepts. Ibram X. Kendi, author and scholar, presents to us the concept that racist policies came before racist ideas. Those in power act in self-interest and consequently enact racist policies such as slavery, immigration, and redlining in order to maintain that power. These policies result in racial inequities, such as the lack of wealth or education, which lead to the development of racist ideas by others who see these inequities and need a reason to justify why these inequities exist. For example, Black people must be less than. Ibram brings to light that it is the racist policies that are the thread in the fabric. So for me, the light bulb turned on, and maybe for you too. And these, as I mentioned, these came from Ibram's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, which I recommend this book for everyone. I know some of you on this call have read it because we've talked about it, but particularly for those in academia, because Ibram is an academic, and a lot of what he says speaks to us that work in the environment of academia. And that's where I really feel connected to what he has shared and what he continues to share. He's also quite active on social media, so you might consider following him on whatever app you're on, he's on it. And in April 2020, Ibram wrote a piece in The Atlantic where he explained what COVID-19 racial data show us. And I think I have, okay. They show us the disparities between races in testing, infection, and death rates. They show us the racist policies behind disparities and deaths, the racist policies to eliminate, and the racist policies to replace with anti-racist policies that protect equity and life. So my aha moment was that this is not about finding the bad racist people and shaming them. This is about finding the racist policies and changing them. How empowering is that? We can do that. We can all do that. And when we're focused on it together, we actually become more engaged with one another because we're working on something that has meaning. We're working on something that has a goal, and we're working on something that is changing people's lives, which ultimately we're changing our own lives. So it really brings us together. That has been my experience. Another quote from Ibram from that April article: without racial data, we can't see racism. And racism becomes like asymptomatic carriers, spreading the virus and no one knows it. Racial COVID-19 data is a thread that gets our attention, but we still need to examine the fabric. So I'm going to shift and start talking about that fabric again, the climate change fabric. But again, I want to really point out that I think Ibram certainly has been doing this work for a long time, but the timing of when his book came out combined with what has happened and transpired in 2020 has gotten a lot more attention than in previous times when Black folks have been brutally murdered at the hands of police brutality. And so I think that it's he's definitely given us a lot of resources that we can use as we continue to do this work after this talk this evening. So I highly encourage. So the next question becomes, is this my fault? Is this your fault? And the answer is no. This isn't any of ours fault. Remembering Ibram's logic, the policies were in place first. And a lot of those policies were put in place a long time ago. And we know better now. But we can't address racism without changing those policies. And so that's really what I'm focused on in the place where I work, which is the University of Colorado Boulder. I placed on my screen some examples of privilege. I'll read them for those that aren't looking at my screen. They say working from home, socially distancing, wearing a mask without fear of being arrested and or shot while Black, Indigenous, or a person of color. And this is our world in 2020. If you experience privilege, which I certainly do, then this is the time for us to use it. So how does this weave in with climate change? I've just put a slide up, now I've put a slide up behind me of a photograph of a sunset photo that was taken on September 6th in Boulder. And it is of a very smoky sunset, which I'm sure each of us saw, those of us that live here in Boulder. And in Colorado, climate change, which exacerbates wildfires, is affecting us all. And this has been our life for weeks now. We live in perpetual smoke. And I'll say it again, climate change has not been and is not affecting all communities equally. The wildfire smoke across Colorado is evidence of climate change having arrived in the United States in a big way, but there have been signs of it at the neighborhood and cities level for decades. And as we follow the needle through the interweaves of racism and COVID-19 in the climate change fabric, we start to discover that racism is deeply connected to climate change. I think I've said it a time or two in this talk, but it's another way. With high levels of housing proximities to toxic places, poor air and water quality, combined with low levels, also chronic medical issues, combined with low levels of reliable access to healthcare, quality healthcare, and lack of equitable opportunities, we could have predicted how Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the United States would be impacted by climate change. To say it directly, and one more time, climate change has not been and is not affecting all communities equally. The regions most impacted by climate change are the regions of the least polluters and those who cannot change the system to create equity. And this is where our role comes in, because we can change the system to create equity. And when I say we, I mean everyone on this call. And I know we think that we can't. I spent many years of my life, decades of my life, thinking that I could not change the system. And because of my work in climate change and climate change communication, I've come to understand that I can change it. And really, I have to, because we have to do something about climate change. And we can't wait for someone else to figure it out, because they're not going to. And the people that created the problem are not going to figure out the solution to the problem. And so we've got to approach this and address this in a very different way than what we're used to. And that means that we need new voices and we need new creative minds that are willing to say, I can do this work, I can do it. And that's, you're looking at one right now. I am full testimony of this, of someone who thought that I couldn't make a difference. And now I feel that I can, and I know that I am. And the other thing I wanted to talk about in terms of climate change that is not affecting all communities equally is that the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program recently reported in their latest report that approximately 71% of Black people live in counties that are in violation of air pollution standards. These are things that are happening right here in Colorado, and maybe they're just not on our radar, but they're very important and they're actually crucial when it comes to figuring out what to do about climate change. There are a lot of parallels between COVID-19, racism, and climate change. The three that I urge you to consider are that all of them are global, all of them demand action now, and all of them are here now. So the question becomes, what can you do? And what can I do? Listening to this short talk isn't going to give you the tools or the skills you need to enact large-scale changes. So the question remains, how do we get people talking about this? How do we create change? That seems to be the topic of the hour, no matter what level we're at a national level or even international level, is how do we get people talking about this and how do we create change? So climate change, between the three, climate change, racism, and COVID-19. Climate change is the thing that people can identify with, even if they can't make the connection between racism and climate change. But we can typically start there because, I mean, this is where I've given talks many times, those of you that have seen me before, is that we find where we can connect. And that is that we all want a safe place to live. We all want healthy friends, families, and communities. No matter where our background is, no matter our socioeconomic status, our political status, we can all agree that we want a safe place to live. We all want healthy friends, families, and communities. And so that's where we find our common ground. And from there, the possibilities are limitless as to where we can take the conversation. It being 2020, I recommend you start with the parallels between COVID-19 and racism, because those are the things that are on people's minds more than climate change is right now. And that's okay, because as I continue to say, racism and climate change are deeply intertwined, and racism and COVID-19 are deeply intertwined. So it's okay to be talking about COVID-19 and racism and knowing that you're also having an impact on what we're going to do about climate change. And just remember that the principle remains the same, whether you're talking about COVID-19, racism, or climate change, that everybody wants to feel safe where we live, and everybody wants healthy family, friends, and communities. And I think that's something really to just digest and try to keep in mind as you go out in your daily lives, whether it's the grocery store or standing in line at a restaurant or whatever it may be, that we all have something in common. And that's a good place to start conversation when you are feeling that need really coming from within, that you want to talk about something that's on your mind and is probably on other people's minds too. So start there. And from my experience, I've learned that the more you talk about both, whether it be COVID-19 and racism and climate change, then the more comfortable you feel talking about both. And over time, you start to weave in climate change and how it's a major consequence of racism. But I understand it's a lot to take in. And even the title of this talk, to have all three in 2020, and that we're living through all three in 2020 is quite a bit. It's quite a lot. I do want to take a moment just to acknowledge, though, that people of color and our Black and Indigenous friends and family and colleagues is not new to them. The climate change piece is certainly stressful for all of us, but dealing with racism and yet another brutal murder by police, et cetera, is not new. And some are grateful that we're showing up in 2020, and some are feeling really tired and wishing that we had shown up a lot sooner. So I want to acknowledge them and acknowledge that those of us like me that are making this our first priority, we're not going to go away. This isn't trendy, that my life has changed forever. And I know many others on this call are as well. So what do we talk about? Good question. So before I was talking about climate change, I didn't talk about it at all. I didn't feel qualified to talk about climate change. Also didn't feel qualified to talk about racism. So when it comes to climate change, I started following social media accounts of people and organizations that are talking about climate change, or at the time they were calling it global warming. And over time, I started to educate myself using their material. And from my story, ultimately, I became so curious that now I study the climate system. And that's not everyone's story. So you will be different. But I do recommend following, because we are all on social media, following groups and organizations and people that are talking about climate change. It does help you to start to become fluent in talking about matters that have to do with climate change in your daily conversations with your family and friends. And I guarantee that over time, your family and friends are going to be talking about climate change more and more. And so the sooner you get yourself comfortable talking about it, the better. But I'll also say that for me, I started reading things on social media and watching videos. And then over time, I started sharing them. And then over more time, like maybe 6 months or so, my own family and friends started asking me questions about climate change. And I didn't feel qualified to answer them, but it kind of set me up, apparently, to get me where I am today, that now I do know about climate change and I speak very freely about it. So certainly if I can do it, you can do it, is the point of that story. And another way of thinking about this is when COVID-19 came to your state, you didn't know very much about it, but you were talking about it. Everybody was talking about it, and we didn't know anything about it, but we were talking about it. And so the question is why? Why were we talking about it, even though we didn't know anything about it? Maybe we can keep talking about that after the presentation today, because I do think that it's related, but it certainly is a principle that can be applied to talking about climate change and racism and the connection between COVID-19, racism, and climate change. So more questions. Do you still talk about COVID? Do you feel qualified to talk about COVID now? Do you still say the same thing about it that you did last March? Probably not, as we've educated ourselves as more knowledge became available to us. And in some cases, we re-educated ourselves. I know I did. And the same principle applies to talking about racism and to doing something about racism. We're past due to educate ourselves, and we're definitely past due to re-educate ourselves. We've talked recently at the University of Colorado Boulder about how the definition of racism in 2020 is very different than the definition of racism, say when you went to college, or say 20 years ago, or even a decade ago. And so this is what I mean when I say re-educate ourselves. And we're also decades past due to change the policies that perpetuate systemic racism. So Cal and I teamed up last fall, and we've grown to understand the crucial role that we play in inspiring ideas and further dialogue about racism and climate change. And hopefully we've done that again this evening. We combine the arts and climate change communication in the hopes that we can get people talking about racism and climate change. Or what I was gonna say is getting people to talk about climate change, which today means talking about racism, and that they'll be more inclined to do something about it if they're talking about it. So the key here is to find your unique way to talk about it and to get others talking about it. The connection between racial injustice and climate injustice can be seen in many ways, and bringing that to light will not only prompt conversation, but it also invites a diverse group to come together and get creative and find solutions. And that's ultimately what I think we're all looking for, is the answer to that how question. So in the way of final words, weave hope and solutions into your message. I keep coming back to that fabric, and I still think that we can do something about changing the fabric of climate change. And so Cal and I gave another talk in July, where we talked about hope and solutions being incorporated into your message, whether you're an artist or a scientist or neither. And we'd be happy to share the link with you. That talk was recorded, and my favorite part about it was an hour-long discussion after the talk, where we had some pretty amazing discoveries amongst artists and scientists talking together. The second thing is find and amplify the voices of those impacted most. I guarantee that they have racism, COVID-19, and climate change on their minds too, and that their ideas are invaluable. And 3, Talk about racism where you live and where you work. Let's normalize systems change. We know better and we can do better. And lastly, let's talk, or even better, let's collaborate. Cal and I are very grateful that you've joined us, and we have plenty of time for discussion, and you're all invited, welcome to share your thoughts, comments, and questions. You can take yourself off of mute or type into the chat bar. And I also lost my last slide, but I wanted to thank Boulder County Arts Alliance for inviting me back. I'm grateful for your work and the openness in finding creative ways to raise awareness on such important topics. And also want to give a huge thank you to Cal Brackin of Onboard Innovations. Cal is a graduate student at CU Boulder like me, and we met thanks to an event called the Engaged Scientist Workshop. And Cal is a brilliant person. I'm so grateful to know him. And I'm thankful again to everyone here that's in attendance. Your support of me and my work is very encouraging, and it motivates me to keep going. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. And now I get to see what Cal wrote.
Thank you,
drew, not wrote.
Wonderful.
Music. Oh, now I'm seeing the chat. Are you there, Cal?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I'm gonna go to speaker view.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Yeah, how did it go watching Cal draw?
It's very cool. Thanks to you both.
Yeah, very helpful.
It's a lot of information all in 20 minutes or however long that was.
Well, I have a question or a concern, and that is how to speak to people who are doing something anti-climate about it, just coming up and talking to them about it without them getting really pissed off. Because I'm afraid of being around somebody pissed off these days.
That is a reasonable question. I have lots of thoughts, but I thought I'll open it up and see if anyone else has thoughts before I give mine.
One thing I've heard and have maybe used once is to introduce the problem using gratitude for the kinds of benefits that fossil fuels have in fact caused. Acknowledging that as part of your opening can be disarming, and also it makes sure the other person knows that you can think along those lines too. You're not just like here to rail against somebody necessarily. I don't know. Trying to build
Even if you are.
Right. And approaching that problem with the intention to understand and be understood in that sense. Less than to convince.
Interesting. What I was going to share was using. I have several talks I could share with you, but there's a group at Yale called the Program for Climate Change Communication, and they've been surveying United States Americans about climate change or global warming for about 20 years, and they present the survey results in the format of maps where we can see kind of regionally, even broken down by county. I think I have one. I do have one. Of course I do. This is all I talk about. But the point of what I'm trying to say, here we go. If you can see my screen. So this comes from one of their surveys, and it's showing estimated number of adults who think global warming will harm them personally. And this survey was given in December of 2019. So it's a little bit small here, but blue colors are 50% or less, and the yellows, oranges, and reds is anything over 50%. So this map is showing that I have other maps, but I don't have them loaded right now. But basically, we're at 7 out of 10 United States Americans believe that global warming is real and that it's here. But when they ask them if they think global warming will harm them personally, that number drops from 7 out of 10 to 4 out of 10, where people just really don't think it's going to impact them. But I bring up this group because what they also have given us, because they've been surveying for this long, is that they've broken up the people that they survey into 6 categories. And you may have heard of these, where the range is like alarmed, concerned, what are some of the other ones? Confused, all the way to deniers, right? And they don't call them deniers, but I'll call them deniers. And so by ranking the people that they survey, what they have found over time is that those that are in the denier category are at 8 to 9% of the United States population. So really not a large number. If you flip that, that's 91 to 92% of the United States population understands that global warming or climate change is real. But a lot of them are confused or unsure, which is definitely the category that I was in for many years. I just really couldn't make sense of it. It seemed to be like there were a lot of conflicting headlines, and I didn't know who to trust, and I didn't know any scientists. And you can't just Google, like, why do ice sheets keep growing if the temperature's going up? It's really confusing. You can't Google that. There's no answer. Nobody's put an answer there. One day I'm going to put an answer there. So my point to all of that is that make the assumption that they're not deniers. Make the assumption that they're confused or they're not educated about what's happening with climate change, or how much certainty we have that humans are the cause of the rapidly changing climate. And then also that if they are deniers are what we would categorize as those that are actively trying to confuse the public, or actively trying to just really stir the pot and get us kind of agitated and aggravated about climate change. Anyone else, and for those people personally, I don't spend time engaging with them. There are some in person that I have, especially if they're a family member. It might take a decade of, going back and forth at the dining table, but eventually they're going to listen, right? Or maybe not. But I still think if there's 90% of us that are saying, okay, this is a big deal, or that this is a deal, then those are people that are well worth our time to talk to.
So can you guys hear me?
Yes.
This is Marta, sorry. Oops, I'm putting my head under the desk. My desktop volume quit in the middle of your great talk. So sorry, Holly. So I missed a lot of it. You may have already said this. So I wanted to go back to Felicia's question, and I'd love to get your information. I've been on this quest, as she knows, which is to ask people, and I've lessened now because of COVID, but to ask people if they could consider not idling their car. And they're, while they're sitting there texting and talking on the phone. I mean, there's just like a whole bunch of things. And I've tried all different kinds of strategies. And I'm actually going to be, once COVID is over, working with the Boulder Valley School District and some of the other city folks about a campaign that kids can do to hand out little business-sized cards that has information on it and about idling and stuff like that with the arts. And but my question is what you were going to say. What your strategy said, because I'm very aware of the Six Americas, study, and if for those of you guys don't know about it, it's fabulous, and it's dismissive. It's from the alarmed to the dismissive. Thank you. The last one, and it's brilliant work. But what we're trying to really work on is awareness to action. And so can you go back to Felicia's question is, what do you say to not piss people off? And Benjamin, you said, yes, help them to understand the values of petroleum. But I love that, it's great. And but I'm just curious about all the other strategies, because there are volumes of theories and studies and articles about how you do that. And part of it is the difficulty of, humans. And, why is it that humans know that cheesecake is, fattening, but they eat it anyway, or why are people alcoholics or drug addicts or whatever? So anyway, so if you could talk a little bit about that, about the not pissing people off part, I'd love to hear.
Sure. I'd be happy to answer that. Before I do, is there anyone that has thoughts they'd like to share?
So I have a question for you in the same vein, Holly, which is,
Great.
Is there a time when you say it's worth it to piss people off?
That's funny that you're asking me that. Yes, I do think that there is a time when it's worth it to piss people off. But I personally am strategic about that. But I think to answer, I'll take one question at a time. So to answer Marta, I'm coming up on this. I'm not going to say I'm coming up on it. I've been on this different approach that I disagree with any of the campaigns that were put forward to make us think that it's our individual responsibility to do something about climate change. And the reason is because even if every one of us followed every protocol that we've seen suggested, from not using straws to buying electric cars to taking shorter showers, et cetera, until we stop burning fossil fuels, we're not going to make a dent in the amount of carbon dioxide that we're injecting into the atmosphere. And so I think I struggle a little bit with, I personally don't use straws, and I follow as much as I possibly can in my daily life. But I did shift away from telling other people how they should live theirs. I think number one, how I live my life is that I'm influencing the environment that I'm in by what I do rather than what I say. And I know you know that. But I can also see that you're looking at potentially putting together a larger campaign, which I think is great, because that's an education campaign. And you're also saying, until that point comes, let's start educating people that collectively we can make a dent, right? And so I understand very much the approach that you're taking, and I appreciate it. And I think it's inventive and creative to come up with little sheets that people can give. I think giving them to children to give to their parents is the most effective way. Personally, my son came home from school one day and said, "Why don't we recycle?" And within 2 hours, we had a recycle bin, and now he's 23, and I still recycle. So kids definitely have that influence. So I would go that route. But I think what I'm interested personally in is organizing those of us that do understand the major polluters of climate change, that we organize and go to them as a united voice to say, we have to find other solutions. We just have to. And we have the resources and the brain power to do it. And really, I just think these corporations need to focus their shift away from making profit off of oil and gas and shift to making profit off of something else. Like, I don't even need to talk about their business structure, other than where are you getting your profit from needs to not be from drilling and fracking, right? And burning. So that's where I personally have shifted, where I spent a good 5 years really focused on trying to educate the people in my life that they needed to change their daily practices for the sake of solving or addressing climate change. So hopefully that answers what you were saying. I know it's a different answer than what you asked.
It doesn't. The question was, sorry, and I appreciate it, and I'm so glad that you're doing that. And I feel like there are so many different strategies, and everybody needs to do everything, because it was all caused by everybody doing everything in different ways. Just a thought. I would love for you to go back to Felicia's question. How do you not piss people off?
Ah,
You know,
yes.
right? Sorry, don't mean to be so.
You approach them slowly with candy. No, I'm kidding. No, I think
Candy and
well,
rum.
yeah. And then run. No.
Right.
No, I do think that definitely kids have a much larger influence for the campaign that you're talking about doing.
I
right?
don't want you to answer. Sorry, I should never have mentioned that campaign.
Okay.
Never.
You're talking
Sorry.
about in your
I'm
daily
asking
life.
for the philosophical question, like how are you? I'm facing the same thing with racism, you know, because I work in the intersection of climate change and social justice and indigenous worldview and all these kind of things. And it's a very similar thing. It's really about pissing people off, because like if you see somebody doing something racist, you know, you want to gently be able to call it to their attention, and then but how do you do it without pissing them off? That would be my. It's the same family.
Sure. So certainly it's a case by case, but as far as climate change communication, what I have been saying for a while is that you find that connection. What do you have in common? It can be, I mean, I was in line at a restaurant a couple of weeks ago in Boulder, and I had been for a hike that day, and I had like a little sunburn, and you could see where my shirt, I had showered and changed clothes, so you could see like my sunburn line, and the woman in front of me had a similar tan line, and I said, "Oh, did you go on a hike today?" "I went on a hike today." And then we started talking, and before you know it, in 10 seconds, we were talking about the amount of carbon going into the atmosphere because of COVID, that emissions have been reduced. And she brought it up, not me. But it was interesting. She was highly mistaken in saying that 70% of our emissions, we were down 70% across the world because of COVID, and that is not accurate. And so, we ended up having a conversation about that. But I think like my approach is that the first thing I say to someone isn't about climate change. It's about something that we have in common. And so I have to find what that is. And it can be anything. It could be in my parking lot, there's a tree that's missing a lot of bark. And one day I just was passing by and mentioned it to someone, like, I wonder if that tree feels exposed because so much of its bark is missing, or something like that. And then from there, I said, I noticed that you sit in your car a lot while you smoke cigarettes and your motor's running. And I was wondering why you do that. And he said, well, it's really hot, so I want the air conditioner on. And I said, well, I'm wondering if there's another solution, because not only are all of those fumes just sitting here in one big pool around all of these beautiful trees and my balcony, but also, it's going up into the atmosphere where it's going to stay there for 100,000 years. And he was like, you're right. I never thought about that, but we had already connected on something else.
Great.
So then it was harder for him to get pissed off.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. And then Pat, should I get back to your question, or do you feel resolved?
So actually, I think I really admire the way that you approach most of the conversations that I've seen you in, which is you do try to find that common ground. But I also think that there are times when it's okay for people to be pissed off, and that sometimes will lead to having to work through that and to get to other resolutions. And so I'm interested in your thoughts on when conflict is healthy.
Sure. I can only speak for myself. I definitely agree that there are times and moments that it is okay. And I certainly have had many of those calls in the last 4 months at the CU Boulder campus, where I hung up from a Zoom call and thought, I don't know what's going to happen next, because that person is really upset. And so but I also trusted my gut that I needed to say what I needed to say in the moment. And so I continue to do that. But I also will say from my own personal experience that I also am very mindful of how I feel in my body. And that if I get upset to a point where I can't calm myself down, then I'm probably not saying something that is helpful in the long run or the short run. And so that's kind of my gauge is I can feel very passionate about something or very firm about something and speak firmly about it in a manner that is upsetting and the other person gets pissed off. And that's one thing. But if I'm the one who's pissed off, then I'm not effective and I'm not doing anything that's productive. That's how I feel. So that's kind of my gauge for me. But I do agree with you. There are definitely times and moments when it is appropriate, and I agree. It does take. I mean, I've had it happen in my life where I was infuriated, and within a few weeks figured out that person was right, and maybe that person will never know that they were right because I will never see them again. And so you're right. I mean, we have to trust the process. That if we know we're putting good information out there that is helpful, just trust that the people do hear you, even if you never get to see that end result, that they make a change. And
Thanks.
Ben.
That's
Yeah.
helpful.
Thank you, Pat. And how about you, Ben?
Sure. I guess I had a real quick comment and then a question, if that's all right. I think my real quick comment is I totally agree with this, like, when do you piss people off thing. I think another time when that might be possible as unjustified is if there's someone else who really could use the support. Like if pissing someone off means that you're making life easier for a third person, and you've checked in with them and everyone's on the same page, that's another good reason. But when you're trying to change someone's mind, I agree. Like when people get mad, it's not very good in letting them hear you. And so thank you for that. My question I had for you, Holly, is another one of those, like, what do you say when questions? I know your talk focused a lot on how, climate change and racism and COVID-19 are all connected and at root the same thing. And I totally hear that. I'm wondering though, what do you say? What are the words and the tools that you use when someone says, well, we don't have the resources to talk about racism right now because climate change is such a big issue, or we don't have the resources to talk about climate change because racism is such a big issue. I'm curious what words you use to respond to that sort of idea.
Yeah, that happened in a call that I was in today, actually, at the University of Colorado Boulder. And I wasn't the person of color that responded, but another person of color that responded said, I'm going to respectfully interrupt your comment to say, we don't have a choice. We need to talk about this. And it's going to be uncomfortable. And other things are going to get pushed off of the agenda or the budget or whatever it may be, because this is urgent. And one person saying it certainly has weight, but multiple people saying it has more weight. And so I know that's the work that we're doing at the university level, is in organizing ourselves so that we are presenting that same message to say, this is actually urgent. And before this past summer, I was actually really conflicted on, do I use the skills and practices that I'm learning to talk to non-scientists, or do I use them to talk to scientists? Because scientists have not been successful in conveying the urgency of the situation. And so I think about this a lot. How do we go about it? And so for right now, my approach is to team up with Cal, who's an illustrator. And Cal and I don't know how many presentations we've had now, but everyone is different, and we keep evolving to find ways, and we will continue to do so, to find creative ways to get people's attention and to get them. Our goal is every audience member that comes to our presentation takes away something that maybe affects how they do their daily practice, right? So that they're making a change to say, I can do that. But in some way, more of teaching a tool or a skill rather than something they can do, like not using straws or something like that. Just a bit of a different approach. Great. And we are 3 minutes past 7, so I will be respectful of everyone's time. I'm so grateful that you're here. Thank you for staying for the conversation following, and don't let it end here.